Hi, everyone from all around the country. Welcome to today's seminar. First, I want to take a moment and acknowledge the traditional owners and the custodianship of the lands on which we meet today. So Nick and I and Rebecca and those of us at the University of Sydney node are on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And on behalf of all of us, I'd like to pay our respects to their ancestors and descendants who continue the cultural and spiritual contributions to country. We recognize their valuable contributions to Australian and global society and note that today is a very important day, given that it's Sorry Day. So just to introduce myself, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Deborah Cobb-Clark. I'm one of the CIs in the center. So now it's my really great pleasure to introduce Nick Glozier. He is a world-renowned athlete, as it turns out, having played rugby with Boris Johnson, whom he tells me always managed to keep his uniform clean, which somehow seems to me to be kind of a good practice for entering politics. I'm not sure. Nick's also, fond of yachting, sailing across from New Zealand to Australia, riding bicycles, riding motorcycles. He also juggles, I hear. Juggles while walking on a tightrope. In his spare time, he also is a professor of psychology and psychological medicine in the Faculty of Medicine and Health. So he dabbles in a bit of psychiatry, epidemiology, public health stuff. And he's most recently been involved in establishing clinical trials at the RPA hospital.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining me. I'm going to be talking about a couple of projects that me and my team have been working on, really looking about a form of disadvantage that I've been interested in for a long time, which is really around disability. A large part around mental health related disability, but disability in its broadest sense. I had hoped to be a little bit further along with these projects than we actually are, but as some people know, life's thrown me a couple of lemons recently, and despite what all those moronic self-help books tell you, you can't always just make lemonade out of your lemons. But anyway, so these are both sort of projects in progress and really focusing around disability, and particularly looking at the way that our society discriminates against people with disability and some of the ways that people have been looking at trying to ameliorate that disability discrimination. And I'll just explain what I mean later on. These are the people who have paid either me personally or the organisation I work for to do various bits of work and consultancy. Many of these actually are potential conflicts of interest. So thinking things like iCare, the National Disability Insurance Agency, Safe Work and TAL. If anyone wants to ask me about those, feel free later and I'll explain those, and they do get declared in any kind of publications that we do. Just a little bit before, the difference between discrimination and stigma. People often get these things sort of quite confused. So stigma comes from that Greek word. It's the idea of being shunned. It is a mark that was cut or burned into people's skin to show that you should be someone who is shunned. You are a criminal, you're a slave, you're a traitor. And then there are these various forms of stigma, the idea of public stigma, which is a sort of general attitudes and belief of the general public towards a person with disability that can be extended to their family members. And many people, particularly those with disability, have a self-stigma where they actually buy into these society's misconceptions or beliefs about it, believing that they are not as good as others. They can't actually work in the same way that others occur. So those are the beliefs and the attitudes. Discrimination, on the other hand, is a behavior. It occurs when individuals or institutions unjustly deprive others of their rights and life opportunities, generally due to stigmatizing attitudes. Now, of course, discrimination isn't always negative. We discriminate when we go to a restaurant. We discriminate between what food we want. And so in this talk, I'm going to talk about discrimination, and the assumption is generally when I mention it, it is that negative discrimination, this unfair, unjust discrimination. And this is an area really, this is where I actually started my career, really, and my academic career. And actually some of my first papers were involved looking at the impact of the Disability Discrimination Act on mental illness in the UK. And that led to me being employed by the World Health Organization to help them with their International Classification of Functioning Disability and Health, which is a WHO classification of human behaviors and impairment, and really forms the basis of the disability classifications, and was adopted by the World Health Assembly in 2001 and is also incorporated into the UN Convention of the Rights of People with Disability. It also forms the basis of, for instance, the disability assessments and evaluations of the National Disability Insurance Agency in Australia and many other countries. So I'm coming back to an area I've been involved in for many years. And in fact, this is my first data containing paper I ever did back in 1998, when I imagine many of you were maybe at school quite disconcertingly. For those of you who are kind of interested in social survey data now, this was back in a time when you could write to the personnel and human resource directors of FTSE 500 companies, and you could actually give them paper surveys, you could give them things to read, and nearly half of those personnel directors, really busy people, would actually respond to surveys. I mean, the idea of getting those kind of response rates to internet surveys now are just ridiculous. The other thing is, back then, is people also actually told you what they really thought rather than what they think you should hear. And really what we're looking at, what I was giving people was this vignette method, where I was asking people about hypothetical employees and the chances of being employed and what they think would happen to them, or how good they would be. And in these vignettes, the only thing I did was differentiate, saying that someone was coming back to work from either being off with depression or being back off work with diabetes. And there were phenomenal differences. And basically, these personnel directors, human resource directors, saying that actually for someone with, they would almost never employ someone with a history of depression in an executive post, and very unlikely in a manual post. The discrimination, or their attitudes and their supposed discriminatory behaviors, were amazingly different. Now, that's changed a little bit, I think, over time. And whether that's because people tell you something different or because it actually has changed, I don't know. But back then, it's only a couple of decades ago, very, very different thing. Now, around that time, there'd been a number of legislations to try and tackle this disability discrimination. The Australian one in 1992 made it unlawful to discriminate against a person in many areas of life. The definition of disability is actually, the bar is really low. And in fact, I've had a couple of operations recently, and I would count as someone with a disability under this act as a result of that. Because all you need is a temporary disability, which in Australia, I think is actually only 24 hours. In the UK, you have to be disabled for 6 months, and it changes from country to country what it's a person with disability, as they're called in Australia, or a disabled person, as they're called in other countries, actually is defined as. And it's interesting, even extends to sort of past and potential future disabilities. So it's an incredibly, incredibly broad act. And most of the acts are very similar in terms of their definitions of disability. And that's the legislation. And in the employment space, and really I'm going to focus very much around employment and insurance now, it makes it unlawful to discriminate people in recruitment, deciding to get a job. As I've showed you, those discriminatory practices were already highly prevalent, particularly against people with mental illness, terms and conditions, promotion, dismissal. Discrimination is not always unlawful, and there's a whole range of exceptions. For instance, you don't let people with epilepsy fly planes if the epilepsy is uncontrolled. So there's a whole bunch of quite obvious exceptions that can be made. It's not a blanket thing. And many of the regulations that follow on from this disability legislation are around these adjustments and accommodations. And there's a range of adjustments and accommodations in the recruitment and selection, modifying work premises, and we're all changing job design or schedules for disabilities. So working from home, for instance, has been one that has been enabled for a number of people with disabilities. And many of us will have seen over the past couple of decades the way that where we work is now much, much easier to access for people with physical disabilities than it used to be many years ago, or physical impairments, I should probably say. I'm just going to talk a little bit about what we were doing in this. So really what we're planning on doing is we're looking around some systematic reviews of whether or not these Disability Discrimination Acts, these regulations, had an impact on the employment of people with disabilities, as they were meant to do. Systematic reviews, and I don't know how many of you know systematic reviews. Our teams do a lot of systematic reviews, actually. We've got quite an expertise in this. This idea that you start off with a very specific research question, you very systematically search for all of the studies in the literature using a range of databases with a highly sensitive search strategies. There is a very sort of well-developed process of honing down the many studies you find to extract which of the studies that you are going to include in your systematic review, and then extracting the data. And those studies can be quantitative, they can be qualitative. There's a range of different ways, whether you include what's called the grey literature, which are things like government reports or technical reports, and then whether you synthesize the data in generally what's called a meta-analysis. And you can do many systematic reviews without doing a meta-analysis. They're two different things. And I certainly think it's one of those things that we might be kind of rerunning maybe one of the LCC workshops around how to do systematic reviews and meta-analyses, because we've got quite a lot of expertise in this. And this is just an example of a search strategy that we've got here around doing systematic reviews. And you might ask yourself, well, what is the point? It's a lot of work, really, and why do you do systematic reviews? Surely scientists, actually, and social scientists, we're not biased. We're fully cognizant of the literature. Well, the answer to that, and this is an area I work in sleep, is that is frankly rubbish. And in fact, scientists, and I imagine social scientists, are just as biased as everyone else is when it comes to their reading and their citation of the literature. And what I'm showing here is an example of this. This is an example of in the sleep field where they did what's called a citation genealogy. And this is Lisa Matriciani's papers. And what she did is went back and looked at when the introductions of papers were citing the evidence that we are living in a sleep loss epidemic. And you may have seen this in the public. We are living in an increasingly sleep deprived society. What she did is she went back and looked at where the evidence this came from that people were citing. And basically they were opinion polls, they were from student surveys. In one case, actually, they were citing a novel as the reason for where this data came from. So she said, well, this is kind of interesting. Where do we get this information from? And so what they did is they looked at, and this is the sleep, and this over here is the ones in children. So they looked at whether or not, if you'd published a paper showing that sleep was getting worse, or if you published a paper that's showing that sleep was getting better, or that there were mixed trends, what your likelihood of getting cited was. And what you can see over here on the right-hand side, these dark filled in circles, is basically there are 3 papers that reported a decrease in sleep. This is a logarithmic scale. They were far more likely to be cited than any of the papers that showed that there was an increase in sleep or a mixed difference. So the whole field just developed this groupthink that actually we were living in a sleep loss epidemic, because scientists were only citing one particular part of the literature and kept on citing all those parts of the literature, which basically led to the public buying into this at all. And this is a whole bunch of things, and Arianna Huffington jumped on it, as well as a whole bunch of media just repeating what actually turned out to be wrong. And so when we actually did the systematic review in this area, we actually found that there were more studies that showed an increase in sleep across the world than a decrease in sleep across the world. And it's taken us about 8 or 9 years. And finally now in much of the academic literature, you see far less people actually making these claims at the beginning of it. Interestingly, this systematic review was also cited a couple of times to show that we are living in a sleep loss epidemic as well, despite it showing exactly the opposite when we did our own citation review. So basically, this is why we do systematic reviews, because science is biased. And once you've done your systematic reviews, we try and look at the different strengths and the levels of evidence. And again, there are very structured ways of doing this. So we look at, for instance, the quality of the studies, which are, for instance, are they previous meta-analyses, randomized controlled trials, how good the observational studies are, and there are various sort of quality ways of looking at this. And then and you do that on the basis of this NHMRC levels of evidence, certainly in the medical field, and increasingly I've seen it in some of the social science field, that there really is this hierarchy of evidence of what constitutes good evidential basis. So I'm looking at the background for this is what we were trying to do in our systematic reviews to try and identify the impact of disability legislation and regulation on employment of people with initially mental illness or disability due to mental illness. And we were asked to do this by Beyond Blue, and Elizabeth Stratton was the key postdoc who did all this work. We did this, it was brokered by the Sachs Institute. Never do anything one of these for the Sachs Institute. It was an incredibly painful exercise, and they still keep asking us to do these things. You get paid virtually nothing to do it, and it takes a phenomenal amount of time. And when we did the systematic review, they really wanted to look at actually discrimination for depression and anxiety and suicidality, because this was Beyond Blue, who are the funders. We could actually only find 9 papers globally, even that met even basic quality criteria. And interestingly, we looked at 2 different types of legislation. We looked at quota legislation, which is this idea, and I'll get onto this in a second, that organizations of a certain size have to have a certain number of people who meet disability criteria, and then that they receive either benefits for that or they're not fined for that. And that showed some inclusive evidence for either, in some places, that it actually increased employment or reduced employment. And in fact, there was better evidence, although still limited evidence, that the Disability Discrimination Acts actually decreased the workforce participation of people with mental illness. They actually led to a lower level of employment in the years after the introduction of the Act that carried on for some time. So we thought, okay, well, let's take this a little bit further, because we haven't got that much data in mental ill health disability. So let's look at a broader level of disability. And now we're doing this with Jen Smith-Merry, who's leading the disability group within the LCC. And now we're undertaking a systematic review of all of the quantitative studies looking at the impact of legislation and regulations. The main outcome is workplace participation, employment rates, basically. And we were only looking at those studies that had information on the employment rates of people prior to the introduction of an act and post-introduction, generally through interrupted time series analyses, or what I think people would call, sort of looking at the introduction of the act as an intervention. Now, that's not done as a trial or a controlled trial in a certain way, except that we can look at the impact controlling for the fact that people without a disability had no impact of the act. So we can look at the employment rates of people without a disability and compare that to the changes of the employment rates of people with a disability. We are over time going to be looking at changes in the wages of people with disability and the actual amount of time working, because employment rates, and I'll get into this a little bit later, there's something really interesting that goes on around employment of people with disability, and the amount of time you're working can go on for a long time. So this is what we were looking at. This is the main outcome. We wanted to look at a couple of different kinds of interventions. And one of these is a rights-based approach, the core of which is this anti-discrimination legislation, this idea that it is that really the discrimination undermines people's human rights to hold a job and actually to have equal access to employment and the employment processes of people without a disability. Then there is the obligation-based approach, which actually predates the rights-based approach by a long way, that really came from the number of disabled ex-soldiers who came out of the First World War. It was probably the first large-scale war where there were lots of people left who were injured. And in fact, we have seen that more and more and more. Wars don't kill people anymore. Wars leave people very, very injured, particularly now with a lot of head injuries, as well as medical practices and battlefield medical practices have got a lot better. But the First World War was the first real large-scale war where that happened. And basically Europe in the 1920s was left with a phenomenal number of disabled ex-soldiers. And a number of countries across Europe introduced this quota system to try and get these ex-soldiers back into the workforce in some ways. And then that was actually embedded in some legislation in the early 1920s, actually. It's been nearly a century of these areas. And then many of them were updated in several European countries and Japan in the subsequent years. And we'll talk about some of those quota schemes later. And then there's kind of sort of financial incentives, incentive-based approaches, basically paying companies to employ disabled people. And you see this in the Danish flexi-job approach and UK access to work. We also see this in some of the Australian approaches where employers are given subsidies to employ people with disabilities. The subsidies tend to be short-term, and that has an impact we'll see later on. There's also supported employment. And here we're going to look at the impact of the legislation and the regulation about supported employment, because actually, if one looks at the efficacy of supported employment, there is phenomenally good efficacy for these things. If we look in my area, in mental illness, supported employment is actually one of the most effective interventions we have in all of psychiatry. It is really, really effective at getting people jobs. It's way more effective than virtually any other of the psychosocial interventions. And in terms of its effect size, as least as effective as any of our medications and psychotherapy. So I'm not going to talk about the efficacy, but the introduction of regulations and legislation to make that happen. And there's also these negative incentives, these sanctions, a bit like the work quotas. So we have these three different approaches: incentive-based approaches, obligation approaches, and human rights approaches. And this is our kind of search strategy. We looked at papers that looked at basic interrupted time series analysis. We didn't look at qualitative studies. We only looked at papers published in English, which is always one of those limitations in many systematic reviews. And it is interesting, some areas it really helps, particularly if you're looking at Spanish, because you get a lot of South American studies, for instance. And I've done systematic reviews where we have Chinese speakers as well, because you find that a lot of the work is also published in China. Reality is most European stuff does get published in English, really, but it does mean that we are limiting some of our grey literature work. And here are the number of studies that we found. So in the rights-based approaches, it's kind of interesting. The rights-based approaches, the Disability Discrimination Acts, really have only actually been, although they're a kind of Anglo-based approach. For some reason, the Anglo English-speaking countries love these rights-based approaches, and their Disability Discrimination Acts tend to occur in those countries. And actually, we only found 3 countries where they have actually been evaluated, a lot in America, a couple in Britain. Then you've got the obligation-based approaches, which tend to be have been evaluated in a couple of countries, incentives in the USA, and then some sort of blended incentives and rights-based and obligation approaches in some other countries as well. And we're just looking at some synthesis where there have been a number of studies that have enabled us to synthesize these without necessarily looking at any meta-analysis, because it's really impossible to actually combine these in a meta-analysis due to the heterogeneity of how disabilities are defined, when the acts are implemented, etc. So this is the American studies I'm about to show you next. And what this shows you are the changes in the employment rate of people with a disability after the introduction of the 1990 Act in America, and also in California with the Prudence K. Poppink Act, which is a very specific state-based act in California. And basically what we've seen is in every year since the introduction of the anti-discrimination legislation, the employment rates of people with disabilities have fallen compared to the employment rates prior to the introduction of the Act. And in fact, the employment rates of people with disabilities has been continually falling and seems to, I haven't put a trend line on this, it's something we may look at, but I don't think you need to be a statistical guru to spot that appears to be increasing. And in America, and possibly because they've just looked at it, there's kind of an interesting effect. That decline is almost only in men. And in fact, in women, the Act has had an interesting effect. In women, there appears to be an increase in the proportion of people working, but that has been dramatically outweighed by men with disability being unemployed. Now, those are the absolute rates I'm showing you there. The actual relative rates of employment are also incredibly similar. because over many of those years, the actual employment rates didn't change that much as far as the studies were saying. And so 6 years after the introduction of the DDA, the relative employment of people with disability in America had fallen by 7%. A remarkable reduction. We're talking tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people who have left the workforce after the introduction of this act designed to increase their workforce participation. The same is also true in the UK when they put in their thing. So these are kind of stick-based approaches for organisations. In the UK, they haven't looked at any gender differences, but they did look at socioeconomic differences, and the effect was worse for workers from lower socioeconomic factors, and it's worse for medium-sized firms. The larger sized firms, the big corporates appeared to, or people working for big corporates did not appear to be affected so much, but the medium-sized firms were, and I think there's probably a range of different reasons why that. Then we look at some of the quota-based, the obligation-based approaches. Again, although widespread, particularly in Europe, there's actually phenomenally few evaluations of this. Interestingly, in France, when they looked at those surveys in there, after the introduction of the quota-based system in France in the early 80s, the participation rate of people with disability plummeted by about 30% after the introduction of the quota schemes, particularly in the public sector. And when we looked at the analyses of those, it really looked like these public sector companies were changing their behaviours, and not only that, they said that the imposition of the tax or the sanctions, if they did not meet the quotas, were not enough for them to employ people with disabilities. So they said they would rather pay the fines and actually try and meet the quotas, which actually meant that people were being employed less. Hungary, on the other hand, had a really, really strict approach. If any employer who had more than 20 employees did not have at least 5% of their employees disabled, they had a 2% payroll tax imposed. And that sanction was enough to increase the participation rates. So it really looks like your stick has got to be pretty big to actually get people to employ people with disability. There's a couple of pure incentive-based approaches, and this is kind of an interesting one where basically they reduced the social security payments that Spanish firms would have to pay if they met a certain amount, if they increased the number of people with disability. And again, women appeared to benefit. There was no effect on males. There appears to be some effect on women. So women's employment rate increased by 6% across the areas they looked at. And basically, it was costing about 3,000 euros for each job in terms of what it cost the government, which is not actually that bad when you kind of think about it in terms of what effect, what would actually be the resultant effects on the reduction in things like disability income and those kind of protections. However, when they looked at it, and you see this in the disability work in many countries, particularly Australia, what they found is that it increased this temporary churn because the reduction in the social security contributions, and it's the same thing we see here in Australia, where companies get paid to employ people for 3 months or 6 months, is they employ people for 3 months or 6 months. And then those people with disability are let go, and then the company replaces that person with another person with disability in the same job. And so in the only evaluation we have found, the permanent employment rates actually went down, but the churn, the temporary employment rates went up. So although it looked quite good at one level, not a great finding at another level. The blended rates were assessed twice, and this is kind of an interesting one where they looked at incentives and obligations. And Austria evaluated this quite nicely in a few papers, and that does appear to be something. So this idea of not just using a stick or a carrot, but a combination of a stick and a carrot appeared to have an effect in Austria and South Korea. There was an interesting one from Germany where the federal government reported their blended response as an enormous success in public, but the evaluation of it didn't give us quite the data that we could use here. But they said that it actually there was no evidence that it had any positive long-term effect, but it didn't necessarily have a detrimental effect. So this blended approach does appear to happen so far. So really what we've got so far is that there's what we've seen so far is a really generally perverse effect of the DDA legislation where it has been evaluated. One of those things that looked like it was a good thing, but the stick really appears to have failed miserably in terms of getting people back into work and maintaining them back into the work, a reduction in absolute and relative employment rates, mixed for some of these quotas and financial regulatory systems. There's a lot of interesting background trends to this that really make a lot of this hard to interpret. So we've seen across the OECD phenomenal rate reclassification of people who used to be described as unemployed, moving on to disability systems. I remember seeing a paper in the UK where Maggie Thatcher was appalled that in the mid-80s, the UK paid the unemployed more than they paid people who were on disability pensions. They were getting a couple of hundred or so pounds a week more to be unemployed and disabled. And Maggie Thatcher hated the unemployed, but really was quite neutral about the disabled. So they swapped the way around that was. So people who were paid more to be disabled than they were unemployed. And at 7 years later, the government documents showed that the number of people out of the workforce was exactly the same, but all they'd done is just had swapped all the unemployed to becoming disabled now as people shifted onto disability benefits, presumably to maximize their incomes. And we've seen a lot of that across the OECD. The other thing we've also seen is actually a dramatic increase in the prevalence of disability rates across all OECD countries, associated with a decrease in the severity of the impairment with that disability. Now, that should have led to more of these people being employable. They would have a greater capacity, but it doesn't appear to have weighed out that. So there's a lot of difficulties actually making enormous inferences in this, but it doesn't appear to have helped much. I'm just going to talk about, and we've seen disability support right, pensions still continue to increase across the OECD to mental illness, and the labour force exclusion of the people that I see, particularly with psychotic disorders, bipolar disorders, is still phenomenal. Virtually none of my patients have a job. These people are generally in the private sector. The labour force exclusion of people with severe psychiatric disorders has been there for a long time, and these continue to this date. Interestingly, this is the Productivity Commission's recommendations, and really they're not looking at stick approaches anymore. They really are looking at trying to make all of the approaches to increase the labour force participation of people with mental illness, really being around positive approaches, but they are very, very, very focused on health service interactions and health service approaches, rather than some of what appear to be these mixed incentive-based and obligation-based approaches, which do appear to have some work. And I just want to get to the end of it. It's amazing how many countries have Disability Discrimination Act legislation or quota legislation or incentives. And it is amazing how few evaluations there have been. We found evaluations in about 13 countries. And you can find these policies and regulations and legislations in over 100 countries in the world. It is phenomenally broad, phenomenally wide-ranging, and phenomenally under-evaluated, which is rather sad. And we couldn't find a single evaluation of the Australian legislation at all. I'm just going to rattle on a couple other things. Just talk about, have I got time? Can I go on for a little bit more? Or should I finish there?
You got 2 minutes.
I'm going to stop there then. Basically, we've got another piece of work going on around the Financial Services Commission and mental health, looking at the blanket exclusions of people with mental illness. And it's another piece of work that we're doing that I will bore you with at another time. And we're kind of halfway through that, really looking at how we can help the financial services industry actually try and improve the way that they treat people with mental illness, because currently so many of people with mental illness have blanket exclusions for accessing income protection, disability insurance, and we're working with them and actually getting quite a bit of traction actually in that particular area. But I will bore you with that some other time. So I'll leave you there on what is some quite sort of, I think, sad work really, or certainly salutary work about what seems to be very good ideas that have had perverse effects over time. Thank you.
So the takeaway message here is that employment went down, not up.
Yeah.
Do we think that that's a result of these acts? And if so, why would that be happening? Or is that just a trend, do you think?
I think the increasing difference between the employment rates of people without disabilities, employment with disabilities, suggests it's a result of the Act. A number of the papers that came up in the review that we couldn't use in terms of the data actually explored what was happening, and they have shown some quite marked behavioural changes of employers. So, for instance, the quota systems, where employers would actually say that they would rather pay the fines than employ people with disability because it was cheaper to do that. There have been a number of sort of evaluations of people's behaviour, and so what happened is sort of covert discrimination in hiring practices. And I think particularly what we tried to look at is this idea that many of the interventions, because the incentives and the obligations are often temporary, led to this kind of churn rate. I think we also have seen, as I said, that there is this phenomenal increase in the number of people with disability and what's moved on. And I think there's something that is very different about when you move on to a disability or income protection or a disability benefits compared to an unemployment benefit. Because I think fundamentally, an unemployment benefit is seen as temporary. Whereas if you are disabled, that's a permanent label. And that is something that you have for life. And we have seen across many countries. I mean, I started looking at this in the late 90s when I was working with the Office of National Statistics in the UK. And we've seen this over time, is people labeling themselves as disabled, people labeling themselves as having a long-term limiting illness has increased over time. And the threshold of the impairment of which that is has been reducing. So there is, but one would expect that would increase the employment rates as people are employed to, but it doesn't seem to be the case. And the number one exit route, certainly in the UK, and I think it's also true in Australia, if you're on a disability support pension in Australia or the equivalent in the UK, the number one exit route is the old age pension.
Yep.
Which tells us, it's a benefit for life. And once you've been on that for a short, not a very long period of time, the chances of you being employed minimal.
Yeah.
I would also quite like, there has been a recent intervention which we'd love to look at, which is the NDIA. And anecdotally, a number of my patients have stopped working part-time so that they can actually do their NDIA supports. So I think it'd be quite interesting to look at whether or not the introduction of the NDIA and those people who have NDIA packages change the employment and participation rates there.
Yeah. So we have a couple of questions in the chat, right? So Karen's in first, asking about any idea about what would work, and then, at what point in the life course do you think you would want to be intervening? And then Simon's got a question about experiments. So I'll let you just.
Okay, thank you.
Roll those.
The areas we look, I mean, if you think about disability in employed people, by far the biggest causes of disability and impairment in employed people are mental illness and neurodevelopmental disabilities, things that emerge in childhood or in adolescence. And particularly if we look at the more severe forms of mental illness, most of that has emerged by the time you're in your early 20s. So I think a lot really needs to be done around the early intervention there, particularly looking at the transition from school into the workforce, from universities into the workforce, what we're doing to help people with early education or vocational education. Increasingly, clinically, I used to be a bit of a cynic in this area. Clinically now, I will do absolutely anything to keep my patients now engaged in any form of linkage with the workforce. I think the moment you lose any of that structure, the moment you are out of it for a short period of time, you're stuffed. You don't get back in. I mean, Pat McGorry talks about the scaffolding. And I think many of us now, we are now bending over backwards to, even if it's just a few hours a week, but just to stop you losing that kind of that connection.
And I think many of you have heard this phrase of NEET, those sort of young people who are not in employment, education and training. And there's a sort of short-term NEET, those people who take gap years. But the moment you kind of get hit 6 months of being NEET, the chances of getting back in are really, really small. So I think there's a lot of what we're doing is around, vocational support. And so if we're looking at, so for instance, and actually the other thing is working with employers and making it around corporate social responsibility and social justice and enabling employers to see this as part of them being good corporate citizens. We've got some work going with Adam Guastella and his team, where we have been working with EY in placing people with autism spectrum disorders. And again, it's this idea of having supported employment. So basically EY have created a whole job scheme where they will take people on, again, it's time limited, but with support that we are providing. And what's interesting for us is that I can't remember, we put 30 or 40 people through this. We've just applied to the NDIA to extend this program. And the company have taken on a minority of those people, have taken on a few of those people, but 2 of those people are actually my patients. And those two people have both got jobs elsewhere, because all of a sudden they now have a resume that says, I have a job. I've had a job for a period of time. But it's finding those corporate champions, it's finding the employers, and they see this as part of that corporate social responsibility. So I think this obligation approach outside of the carrot and stick, and I think we're seeing this with climate change, we're seeing this with environmentalism, we're seeing this with discrimination, and I think we're seeing, particularly over COVID, this is the area I see really where we've got to be working with employers. And you've got to be working with employers. And all of the programs that we see are often employer focused rather than necessarily large scale regulations about it.
So that kind of leads into the question that Simon was asking about whether, there's an opportunity to kind of use an experimental design then to think about the difference between carrot, sticks and combinations.
Yeah, so the one we're doing with EY, we're actually building in an experiment into it next time, because what we're going to be doing is we're going to be working with an organization that has multiple sites and multiple settings. So we're going to be looking at doing it in certain states and not other states. So again, it's really difficult, as probably many of you are aware, to try and do anything that looks like a randomized controlled trial within organizations. Corporates hate it. However, we've managed to do cluster randomized controlled trials where you can cluster different settings. So we've done those looking at manager training and whether training managers improves management people with mental illness. You can also do stepped wedge designs, which are a really nice way of doing this with organizations, particularly when you're rolling out these kind of sort of psychosocial interventions. And a step wedge design is where you introduce the intervention into one part of the company, and then you roll it out into another part of the company, and then another part of the company, and then another part of the company. And particularly organizations that have similar setups geographically disparate, that works really well, because then you can use both the pre-post within that particular part of the company, and you can also compare cross-sectionally, so you can allow for the confounders over time that occur with recessions, companies' performance, etc. So there are ways to do this. It's really hard to do this particularly with corporates, but some of them are beginning to come on board. But it takes a long time to do this.
We also have Adam with his hand up.
Adam Guastella. Is that Adam Guastella?
Yes.
Adam, do you want to talk about your program a little bit?
No, not at all. That's all right. You summarised it quite well, Nick, and have been a wonderful collaborator to inform it. What I just wanted to ask, though, your presentation really highlighted the legislative issues around supported employment, and I wonder the structural issues around providing mental health care and support in workplaces seems to be a crucial issue, and you've highlighted the mental health issues there. A lot of employee assistance programs are light touch supports in terms of mental health support. What do you think are legislative changes that could make a difference in terms of mental health support in the workplace?
I think the most of the mental health support, and this is a whole other talk, is I think we spend far too much time trying to provide treatments for people who are unwell, and I don't think employers are the right people to provide those treatments. As you say, EAPs tend to be light touch. The only evaluation of EAPs I've ever seen actually evaluates the implementation of full clinical psychology services in organisations, rather than what actually EAPs, which are generally 2 or 3, are now almost entirely Zoom or telehealth sessions. And I think Tony LaMontagne talks about this really, really nicely, this idea of that you've got to take a tripartite approach. Yes, you've still got to actually help people with mental ill health problems or neurodevelopmental problems, or people who are impaired or disabled. But you actually have to take a positive approach. You actually have to improve the positive aspects of the workplace. You've got to look at what the culture is. And you also have to reduce the stressors that we know, so that there are things that we know enable people to remain in the workforce, or actually not so much remain in the workforce, that we know that there are positive things which can prevent people becoming unwell in the workforce, or people who have illnesses from becoming more unwell. So you enhance the positives. We know some about that, not as much as we like to think, but we know a lot about what the negative effects of work are in terms of corporate culture, in terms of job demands and job control, in terms of supportive relationships at work, and trying to enhance those. And that's a lot of what we're trying to do with the manager training within that sector. It's difficult. And what's interesting is the Mental Health Commission and Safe Work, both at the state level and the federal level, are really on board. And for instance, there is a framework within the national, there's a national workplace initiative framework for how employers should create a mentally healthy workplace. And Safe Work have a whole benchmarking tool where organisations can benchmark themselves against other sectors to find out how they are doing in enhancing the positive and reducing the negative stressors. So I think it's really moving upstream rather than focusing on people who have necessarily or are unwell, but really to try and make organisations receptive to people with disabilities and prevent people from becoming unwell and having their impairments aggravated.
So again, that kind of leads into the question. This would be Francis, right? Asking about productivity for people with disabilities. And I imagine the sort of easy answer is, well, it depends on exactly the things that you were saying about how supportive the workplace is. But do we actually know anything about productivity differences for people with disabilities?
Well, I can talk about mental illness. I can talk about, so there's a really, really interesting tension in the public discourse about mental illness. There is the sort of stigma and discrimination discourse, which is everybody should be treated the same. People with mental illness are exactly the same as everybody else. They should be treated exactly the same. Then there is the impairment discourse, the burden discourse, which is actually, we have pretty good data that people with mental illness and people with depression, when unwell, certainly, and people with severe mental illness, actually are not as productive. You know, we have this concept of much of that productivity or lowered productivity is measured as absenteeism. So it is a really interesting tension that has really never, ever been tackled properly that I've seen. You either get people going down the discrimination route, which I presented here, or you've got people going down the, well, actually, you know, the cost of illness approach. You know, mental illness costs this country $20 billion in absenteeism and presenteeism. And so you have this two-pronged approach. And I've never seen anybody bring that together. And in fact, it's one of the things when I ever, you know, spend slightly less time sort of fanning around doing sports and dancing and things like that, that I'm going to try and write the editorial about that, because it is, for me, it is a fascinating thing that no one actually ever engages with properly.
Okay. So Elizabeth's talking, do you know this program in Finland? where, they hire an assistant along with the person with the, I guess it's an example of your assisted work.
That is exactly what,
Right.
I mean, Elizabeth, yeah, that program, person with that assistant, that is exactly what the program that Adam and his team were leading as well. They've also got the same thing in Norway. So a very good friend of mine, Arnstein Mikkelton, who I think actually is possibly one of these myriad of co-investigators. And he's been running some programs looking at this in Norway as well, where they actually hire these assistants. And these assistants are fascinating. They're people who actually, they may go along to people's houses. You go along to people's homes and they help them get dressed in the morning and get to work on time. They stay with them in the workplace. They talk with you, but they're actually really well integrated. So they are quite costly. And no, I've never seen a cost effectiveness analysis of this. And what you see is a lot of sort of anecdote about how great they are and publications. But again, I've never seen any good, proper evaluation of them.
Okay. And then Carolyn's asking a question about, do we know anything about the kind of positive impact for firms or corporations that, sort of do this out of a sense of social obligation, or, are there reputational effects, for example?
You'd hope so, wouldn't you?
You would hope so.
You would really. Right? I actually don't know, Adam. We need to build this into the net. If we get the rollout of the project, we need to roll that into it, don't we? Yeah.
What I would say is that we've been contacted by lots and lots of corporations that want to have a positive impact on disability recruitment and employment, but just simply do not have the know-how and feel safe to take the steps to do that. So I think that reputationally, that's the companies that we're involved with. Reputation and community good is a strong motivator. But and I think more organisations would do the same if a lot of the discriminatory fears and lack of knowledge didn't also contribute to the barriers. So I think it is a major motivator for many organisations, and the NDIS themselves are placing employment, as we all know, as a major priority, and there's funding there for to engage people. So I think it's a changing and evolving scene. But as we develop guidelines, I think that more employers will engage.
Yeah, we've worked with Black Dog. So we had a big program a few years ago, and we developed a number of managerial, because it's often the managers, they don't know what to do. They don't know what to do if someone breaks down or acts oddly. How do you manage a team that has someone with a mental health or neurodevelopmental disability? And so Amy Guyad, the Black Dog, has led quite a bit of work with a few of us also quite closely involved, developing a range of manager education programs about that. And the key, as Adam said, it's not so much about knowledge, it's actually about confidence. And we distinguished it, and that is and confidence and resources. So often what happens is organized is there's a whole bunch of people who run corporate training stuff where they go in and they run a 2-hour corporate training, and everyone remembers it for like the next 35 minutes. And because managers are busy, they've forgotten it the following week. And so having those kind of resources, and so we've developed a whole bunch of online resources, little YouTube videos. The length of time actually is the length of time you can go to the toilet and pretend you're going to the toilet, and it doesn't look onerous. So you can go and watch your YouTube video on the toilet to help you deal with that problem that's emerging. So it's a really interesting space to work in, and I think we should be looking at that corporate impact. So thank you, Caroline. It's a really nice suggestion.
Right. Well, we're at time, so I just would like to thank Nick. Thank you, Nick, on behalf of all of us. I mean, I'm astonished that a rugby player knows as much about the topic as you seem to know.
I didn't have too many concussions.
Yeah, apparently. So the seminar coordinators for this series, which it's just really been a fabulous contribution to the Life Course Center, are Rennie Lee from UQ and Nancy Kong from Sydney. So thank you for your work and kind of putting the seminar series together and coordinating everything for us. If anyone wants to do a seminar in the series, contact either Rennie or Nancy. And the other thing to just remind you of is that there will be a recording made, and it will be available in a few weeks on the Life Course Center I'm sure it'll be on LCC Central at some point. The next seminar will be on the 15th of June, and the speaker is Chris Carbonic from Sweden. So thank you, everybody.